I leaned back in my chair, staring at the stack of reports on my desk. Being the director of the local branch of Henderson Manufacturing was usually manageable, but today had been a nightmare. Two of my subordinates had botched a major project, and naturally, I was the one held accountable. Adding to my misery, a toothache had started nagging me last week, and had only gotten worse. I glanced at the clock. It was already 4 p.m., and I hadn't taken a break all day. I decided to step outside for a smoke. As I walked through the office, my assistant Jenny handed me another report. "Mr. Wilson, this just came in. They need it reviewed by the end of the day." I forced a smile. "Thanks, Jenny. I'll get to it." Outside, I lit a cigarette and took a long drag, feeling the tension ease slightly. The cool breeze was a welcome relief from the stifling office. I stared at the parking lot, my mind wandering back to how I ended up here. I started with Henderson Manufacturing right out of college. Back then, I was full of ambition and energy, eager to climb the corporate ladder. I worked hard, often putting in long hours and sacrificing personal time. It paid off, and I quickly moved up the ranks. A few years ago, I was offered the position of branch director, a role that came with more responsibility than I had anticipated. I took another drag of my cigarette, thinking about my family. Claire and I had been married for over 20 years, and we had a 19-year-old son, Josh, who was away at college. Claire had always been supportive of my career, even when it meant I was often absent. Recently, though, things had felt different between us. I chalked it up to the stress of work and life. I finished my cigarette and stubbed it out, taking one last deep breath before heading back inside. As I walked back to my office, I passed by the desks of the two employees who had caused today's mess. They avoided eye contact, clearly aware of their mistakes. I didn't have the energy to confront them again. I just needed to get through the day. Back at my desk, I tackled the pile of reports with a sense of resignation. This was my life now. Constant stress, endless responsibilities, and little appreciation. The toothache flared up again, and I made a mental note to call the dentist. The phone on my desk rang, and I picked it up, bracing myself for more bad news. "Dan, it's Claire," her voice came through, sounding uncharacteristically tense. "Can you come home a bit early today? We need to talk." I frowned, sensing that something was wrong. "Sure, I'll try to wrap things up here. Is everything okay?" There was a pause before she replied, "We'll talk when you get home." I hung up, feeling a knot form in my stomach. Claire's tone had set off alarm bells in my head. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept drifting back to her words. What could be so urgent that she needed to talk to me right away? The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls. By the time 6 p.m. rolled around, I had managed to clear most of the urgent tasks from my desk. I grabbed my coat and headed out. The drive home was anything but smooth. As I navigated through the usual traffic, my mind was preoccupied with Claire's unsettling phone call. I barely noticed the car behind me until it was too late. The sudden jolt of the collision snapped me back to reality. I pulled over, heart racing, and stepped out to inspect the damage. A man in his mid-30s emerged from the other car, looking furious. I guess I won't share what and how we talked about, but in the end we agreed that we needed to call the police. I glanced at the damage. His front bumper was crumpled, while my rear bumper was hanging by a thread. Minutes later, the police arrived and began registering the accident. After questioning both of us and examining the scene, it was clear the other driver was at fault. He had been speeding, and his reckless driving had caused the collision. He also kept the distance between our cars too low. "You're lucky no one got hurt," the officer said to the other driver, "but you'll need to pay for the damages and might face a fine for speeding." As they wrapped up the paperwork, I exchanged my information with the officer and the other driver. The whole process took longer than expected, and my toothache had evolved into a throbbing pain that pulsed with every heartbeat. I sighed, knowing I still had to take the car to the service station before heading home. At the service station, they confirmed what I already knew. The rear bumper needed to be replaced. I arranged for the repair and left the car in their capable hands. They assured me it would be ready by the next day. Finally, I called a cab and headed home. Claire's words from the phone call echoed in my mind as the cab pulled up to our house. I paid the driver and walked up the driveway, noticing Claire standing by the front door waiting. "Dan, are you okay?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern as I approached. "Got into a minor accident," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "But I'm fine. What's going on, Claire?" She took a deep breath and led me inside. We sat down in the living room, the weight of the day's events settling between us. "Dan, there's something I need to tell you," she began. I braced myself. "Don't tell me you need a new purse." "No, it's about us," she said, looking me directly in the eyes. "And about Josh." I frowned. "What about Josh? Is he okay?" "Yes, he's fine," she reassured me. "But it's about what kind of example we're setting for him." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Claire, just get to the point. What are you trying to say?" She took a deep breath. "I've met someone. His name is Greg, and he's made me realize how distant we've become. How much we've both changed." I felt a cold wave of shock. "You've met someone? What does that even mean?" "It means that I've been seeing him," she said quietly. "I didn't plan for it to happen, but it did. I needed to tell you because living a lie isn't something I can keep doing." I stood up, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger. "So what now, Claire? You tell me this and expect what? For me to just accept it?" "I don't expect anything," she said, her voice trembling. "I just couldn't keep pretending everything was fine." "How long?" I demanded. 6 months, she admitted, her eyes downcast. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to process her words. "And you choose now to tell me? After I've had the worst day possible?" She looked up, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't know how to tell you. There's never a good time for this kind of thing." I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside me. "What do you want from me, Claire?" "I want us to figure out where we go from here," she said softly. "I know I've hurt you, and I'm sorry. But we need to decide what's best for all of us, especially for Josh." I nodded, the anger giving way to a deep weariness. "All right, we'll talk. But right now I need some space to think." Claire nodded, wiping her tears. "Take all the time you need." I stepped outside, the evening air cool against my face. The next morning, I called a taxi to take me to the dentist. The toothache had become unbearable overnight, and I regretted not making an appointment sooner. As the cab navigated through the city streets, my mind drifted back to Claire's revelation the previous evening. We met on a dating site. Our first date was at a quaint cafe downtown. I remembered feeling an immediate connection, a mutual sympathy that only grew stronger with each date. Before long, we were inseparable, eventually getting married and having our son, Josh. There was a time, about 5 years into our marriage, when we separated for a year and a half. We both thought the reasons were significant then, but looking back, they seemed trivial now. It was a rough patch that we managed to work through, but now, with Claire's recent confession, it felt like history was repeating itself in a more complicated form. The cab pulled up to the dentist's office and I paid the fare, stepping out into the cool morning air. I walked into the building, checking in at the front desk. After a short wait, the dental assistant called me back. Dr. Thompson greeted me with a firm handshake. "Good to see you, Dan. What seems to be the problem?" "Toothache," I replied, pointing to the left side of my mouth. "It's been getting worse over the past week." "Let's take a look," he said, guiding me to the examination chair. I reclined, opening my mouth as he examined my teeth. I see a small cavity here," he noted. "Well, need to fill that. Your teeth are quite yellow, too. Smoking?" I confirmed. "Yeah, stress from work. I smoke a lot more than I should." He gave me a knowing look. "It's not uncommon, but it's not good whatsoever." "I know," I said, feeling a bit defensive. "It's just been a rough period." Dr. Thompson nodded sympathetically. "I see. Let's get this cavity taken care of." He began working on my tooth, the sound of the drill filling the room. I tried to focus on anything but the discomfort. My mind wandered back to the dating site where Claire and I had first connected. It seemed almost surreal that our relationship had started so simply and had now become so complicated. "All done," Dr. Thompson said, breaking through my thoughts. "I've filled the cavity. You should feel better now. Just be mindful of your smoking. It really does take a toll." I sat up, feeling the numbness in my mouth where he had worked. Thanks, Doc. I'll try to cut back. He handed me a prescription for some painkillers just in case. If the pain persists or if you have any other issues, give us a call. I nodded, pocketing the prescription. Will do. In the evening, I got a call from the service station letting me know my car was ready for pickup. Relieved, I called a cab and made my way over, eager to have my car back. The repair had taken longer than expected, but they assured me everything was in perfect order. I inspected the car and sure enough, the new rear bumper looked just as good as new. I settled the bill, thanked the mechanic, and drove off, feeling a bit of normalcy returning to my life. As I navigated through the evening traffic, I decided I needed some company and clarity. I called Josh. Hey Josh, how about we grab some dinner tonight? I asked, hoping for some time to unwind. Sure, Dad, he replied. I'm just about done here. I'll be ready in about 30 minutes. Great. I'll swing by and pick you up, I said. I drove to his college, trying to focus on the road and not the tumultuous thoughts swirling in my mind. When I pulled up, Josh was already waiting at the curb, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He hopped in and we exchanged smiles. Hey, Dad, thanks for picking me up, he said. No problem, son. How's school? I asked as we headed towards our favorite restaurant. Pretty good. We got a new genetics teacher, Dr. Patel. He's fantastic. Makes everything so much more interesting, Josh said, his enthusiasm evident. I'm really glad I chose biotechnology. That's great to hear, I replied, genuinely happy for him. It sounds like you're really getting into it. We arrived at the restaurant, got a table, and ordered our meals. Josh seemed a bit hesitant, like he had something on his mind. Dad, there's something I need to tell you, he said, breaking the silence. I looked at him, concerned. What is it, Josh? Last week, when you were at work, I was at home playing on my computer with headphones on, he began. Mom thought I couldn't hear anything, but when I got up to go to the bathroom, I heard voices. My heart sank. Go on, I said, bracing myself. It was Greg, he said quietly. I heard him telling Mom that he was leaving her and didn't want to be with her anymore. She was really upset, Dad. I think she wanted to leave you for him, but he dumped her first. I took a deep breath, trying to process this new information. So she told me because she didn't have a choice. I said, more to myself than to Josh. Josh nodded. Yeah, it seems that way. I just thought you should know. I felt a mix of anger and sadness, but pushed it aside for now. Thanks for telling me, Josh. I appreciate it. Our food arrived and we ate in relative silence, the weight of the conversation hanging between us. After dinner, we decided to take a walk. The evening air was cool and the streets were quiet. You know, Josh, I'm really proud of you, I said, breaking the silence. You've grown into a thoughtful and responsible young man. Thanks, Dad, he said, smiling. I just want us all to be okay. We walked back to the car and I drove him back to his dorm. As he got out, he turned to me. Take care of yourself, Dad, and let me know if you need anything. I will, Josh. Thanks. Take care, I said, watching him head inside. When I got home, the house was unusually quiet. I walked in, tired from the long day, and headed straight for the living room. As I rounded the corner, I froze. Claire was there, standing in the middle of the room with Greg. Both of them looked up as I entered, and the tension in the room was palpable. Claire's eyes were wide, a mixture of surprise and determination. Greg, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to be anywhere but there. Dan, Claire started, her voice trembling. I know this looks bad, but I can explain. I held up a hand, stopping her. No need to explain, I can see what's going on. Greg stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. Look, man, I didn't want to come here. Claire insisted. She wanted to prove how much she loves you and wants to make things right. Claire's face turned red. That's not true, Greg. You came here without asking, trying to harass me. I told you it's over, but you wouldn't listen. I took a deep breath, glancing between the two of them. Remembering what Josh had told me about overhearing their breakup, I was more inclined to believe Greg. Is that so? I asked, looking directly at Greg. Yeah, Greg said, nodding vigorously. I was leaving, but she wouldn't let me. She kept saying she needed to prove something to you. Claire looked desperate now. Dan, you have to believe me. He just showed up. I didn't ask him to come. I shook my head, too tired to argue. Greg, leave my house now. Greg nodded, relief washing over his face. Gladly, I'm out of here. He walked past me, heading for the door. As he left, Claire stood there, tears streaming down her face. Dan, I'm not going anywhere. This is our home. I want to fix this. I looked at her, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. I'm too tired to argue, Claire. Just stay out of my way tonight. She nodded, wiping her eyes. All right, Dan, we'll talk tomorrow. I watched Greg's car pull away before heading upstairs. I needed to clear my head and process everything that had happened. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to avoid another confrontation with Claire. I showered, dressed quietly, and left the house before she even stirred. As I drove to the office, an idea began to form in my mind. Swapping places with another branch director might give me the fresh start I needed. When I arrived at work, I immediately scheduled a meeting with Tom, the director of our downtown branch. Tom and I had always gotten along well, and I hoped he might be open to the idea. After a brief wait, Tom walked into my office looking curious. "Morning, Dan. What's up?" he asked, taking a seat. "Morning, Tom. I've been thinking about a change. Things have been pretty rough lately, and I need a fresh start. I wanted to propose a swap, branch director positions. You take over here, and I'll take your spot downtown." Tom raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a proposal, Dan. What's going on?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Personal stuff, mainly. It's been affecting my work, and I think a change of scenery might help. Plus, I know you've always been interested in this branch." Tom leaned back, considering. "It's true, I've always liked the idea of running this branch. But are you sure this is what you want? It's a big move." "I'm sure," I replied, nodding. "I need this, Tom, for my own sanity." He nodded slowly. "All right, let's talk to corporate and see if we can make this happen. It might take a bit of time, but I'm open to it." "Thanks, Tom, I really appreciate it," I said, feeling a glimmer of hope. We spent the rest of the morning discussing the logistics and drafting an email to corporate. By the time we were done, I felt more optimistic than I had in days. This change could be exactly what I needed. As lunchtime approached, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The city streets were bustling with people, but I barely noticed them. When I returned to the office, there was a message from corporate. They were intrigued by the proposal and wanted to set up a meeting to discuss it further. I quickly scheduled the meeting for the next day, eager to move forward. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork. I stayed late, partly to catch up on work and partly to avoid going home. When I finally left the office, it was well after dark. Driving home, I rehearsed what I would say to Claire. I needed to be firm, but calm. This change was about more than just escaping her. It was about finding myself again. As I pulled into the driveway, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the inevitable conversation. I entered the house quietly, relieved to find Claire already in bed. I headed to the kitchen, made a quick dinner, and sat alone at the table. 2 weeks had passed since I started working at the downtown branch. The change of scenery was a breath of fresh air. The employees here were diligent and responsible, a stark contrast to the slackers I'd had to deal with at my old branch. My tooth had stopped bothering me, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I could breathe. During this time, Claire and I had talked a few times. She was persistent in trying to convince me to forget everything that had happened, urging me to think about our son's future. "Dan, for Josh's sake, can't we just put this behind us and move forward?" she had pleaded on one call. I had sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the situation. "Claire, Josh is an adult now. He can take care of himself. I'll always be there for him, but I don't need you for that. We can't just sweep this under the rug." Her voice had faltered. "But Dan, we've built so much together. Are you really willing to throw it all away?" I had been firm. "Claire, I don't trust you anymore. I can't live like this, always wondering if you'll go back to Greg or someone else. I've decided to file for divorce." That conversation had been one of the hardest, but it was necessary. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The decision to divorce wasn't easy, but it was the only way I could move forward. One morning I arrived at the branch office expecting the usual hustle and bustle of employees starting their day. But as I walked in, the silence was deafening. Usually, half of the workforce would already be there, chatting, typing away, or grabbing coffee. Today the office was eerily empty. Frowning, I walked through all the departments, checking every office and cubicle. Not a single person was there. I pulled out my phone to check for messages, but there was nothing that explained this sudden absence. I went to my desk, turned on my computer, and opened my email. There, in my inbox, was a message addressed to all colleagues and employees of the company. The subject line read, "Urgent, immediate action required." My heart sank as I read the contents. The email stated that our branch had been attacked by hackers, and our entire database had been leaked. Due to this force majeure situation, all employees were sent away at their own expense for an indefinite period. As I was processing this shocking information, I heard footsteps echoing through the empty office. I looked up to see a man I didn't recognize entering the branch. He was tall, wearing a dark suit, and had an air of authority about him. "Hey, who are you?" I called out, standing up from my desk. He walked over, his expression serious. "This place is closed now. It will soon be rented out to new tenants. You need to leave." I was taken aback. "What do you mean? I'm the branch director here. I need to understand what's going on." He shrugged. "I don't have all the details, but I was instructed to ensure the building is vacated. The company is dealing with the fallout from the hack, and this branch is being shut down permanently." I felt a wave of frustration and disbelief. "Shut down? Permanently? I wasn't informed about this." He nodded sympathetically. "I don't care if you were or not. You should pack up your things and go." I stared at him, trying to process the situation. "All right," I said, resigned. "I'll pack my things." He required me to gather my belongings. As I packed up my desk, I thought about the irony of it all. Just as I was starting to find some stability after the chaos in my personal life, my professional life was thrown into disarray. I finished packing and took one last look around the empty office. It looked really deserted without things. After loading my things into the car, I began calling my colleagues, starting with Tom, who had swapped branches with me. Tom answered on the second ring, his voice sounding as shocked as I felt. "Dan, what's going on? I just heard the whole company is shutting down. What happened?" "Tom, this is insane. They didn't give us any warning. Did you get the email about the hack?" I asked, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Yeah, I saw it. The whole database leaked. They're saying it's catastrophic." "I'm just as blindsided as you are," Tom replied, sighing deeply. "Look, in this situation, everyone is scrambling to figure things out. It's probably best if you focus on getting your own life sorted right now." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah, I guess you're right. Thanks, Tom. Stay in touch." We ended the call, and I tried to contact a few more colleagues, but no one picked up. It seemed everyone was too busy dealing with their own and sudden crises. As I pulled into the driveway and started bringing in my things, Claire appeared at the door, her eyes widening in surprise. "Dan, what's going on? Why are you bringing all your stuff home?" I looked at her, feeling a surge of resentment. "Why do you need to know? You're not my wife anymore." Claire's face twisted with indignation, and she pushed me on the shoulder. "Don't act like we're complete strangers, Dan. What happened?" I sighed, dropping my things and sitting down on the couch. "The entire company is shut down. Hackers hit us, leaked everything. They closed the whole company and everyone is out of a job." Claire's mouth fell open in shock. She muttered to herself, not really to me. "Did he really do it?" My head snapped up. Who are you talking about, Claire?" "You don't need to know," she said, her voice defiant. "You're not my husband anymore." I raised my voice, filled with anger. "Tell me, Claire, now!" She flinched, then apologized quickly. "I'm sorry, Dan, it was Greg. He was persistent after we slept together a few times. He told me he loved me, wanted me to leave you and marry him, but I refused." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Greg, that slug is who ruined everything." Her answer went incredibly stunning. "Yes, he owns a computer information technology store and works with hackers. He said he could cause a leak of information for your entire company." I grabbed my head, feeling a headache forming. "Why didn't you say anything?" She looked down, ashamed. "He threatened me, Dan. Said he could blow up my car remotely or my phone while I was using it. I was terrified." I sat back, stunned. "And what about our son?" He told me he saw Greg leaving you, saying he didn't love you anymore. Claire looked confused for a moment, then realization dawned. That wasn't Greg. That was another man I was seeing. He left after our first sex together. Josh must have mistaken him for Greg. I felt a wave of nausea, somehow missing the fact that she had another lover. Why didn't you go to the police? Because Greg scared me, Dan. I didn't know what else he could do, she whispered. The more time I spent without him, the more I became convinced that he was a psychopath. I sat on the couch, trying to process everything that had happened. After a minute of silence, I took out my phone and dialed 911. Claire watched me with a detached expression as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. I'll do this for myself and for the company, not for you, I told her as I hung up. Do what you want. I don't care anymore, not about you or your company, she replied coldly. Her words stung, but they also made things clearer. She hadn't told me about Greg's threats because she genuinely didn't care about me or my career anymore. The realization was like a punch to the gut. When the police arrived, I explained everything. The company I worked for, Henderson Manufacturing, has shut down because of a massive data leak. I am the branch director, and I believe a man named Greg Smith, is behind it. He's a known associate of my wife and has a computer store nearby. I'm sure he's running a hacker operation from there. The officers took detailed notes, listening intently. We need to check this out. Do you have the address of his store? One of the officers asked. Yes, it's just a few blocks away, I replied. Claire remained aloof as I gathered my things. She didn't even glance my way when I left with the police. I knew she was planning to take her share of the property and move back to her parents. This was the end of us, and there was no going back. We arrived at Greg's store, a small, nondescript place on the corner of a busy street. Inside, a young guy was behind the reception desk, looking a bit nervous as we approached. Can I help you? He asked, eyeing the police officers warily. We're looking for Greg Smith, I said. We need to ask him some questions about a recent cyberattack. The guy shook his head. I don't know anything about that. Greg's not here right now. Do you know where he conducts his other business? One of the officers asked. The guy looked genuinely confused. I really don't know, I just work here. The police exchanged glances, then one of them turned to me. There's no reason to detain him or search the store without more evidence. Well, take this information into consideration and look into Greg Smith further. I felt a wave of frustration and disappointment. So that's it? We just leave? For now, yes, the officer replied. But we will investigate this further. If Greg is behind the cyber attack, we'll find out. We left the store and I couldn't help but feel dejected. Nothing had worked out the way I had hoped. Claire didn't care, Greg was nowhere to be found, and my career was in shambles. As we drove back, I wondered how I was going to rebuild my life from this mess. I came back home feeling defeated and drained. As I walked in the door, I saw Claire, almost ready to leave. She was dressed up, suitcase by her side. Where are you going? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. To my parents, she replied coldly. And then I'll see. Goodbye, Dan. Thanks for wasting the best years of my life. I bit back a retort and instead said, as you say. Can you do me one last favor? Where is Greg's home? She looked at me with a mix of disgust and pity, but still gave me the address and left without another word. I watched her go for a while. Left alone, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I got into my car and drove to Greg's address, a one-story house in a residential area. The neighborhood was quiet, and as I parked and walked up to the entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I peeked through the windows, trying to get a sense of what was inside. Through a gap in the curtains, I saw a disorganized mess, papers, gadgets, and clothes scattered everywhere. It looked like a storm had blown through. I grabbed the door handle, and to my surprise, it was open. I stepped inside cautiously, the silence of the house pressing down on me. Greg, I called out, but there was no response. I moved further into the house, the chaotic state of the living room making it clear that Greg had either left in a hurry or had been searching for something. As I made my way to the bedroom, the sight that greeted me stopped me cold. Greg was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, a fire axe sticking out of his back. I stood there horrified. my mind racing to comprehend the scene in front of me. Snapping out of my shock, I urgently called cops. While waiting for the police to arrive, I noticed a laptop on a nearby table. It was turned on, but the screen was locked, asking for a password. I tried to think of what it could be, but had no luck. Frustrated, I scanned the room, noting the chaos. Papers scattered, drawers pulled out, items strewn across the floor. The police arrived quickly, and I stepped outside to meet them, pointing them towards the bedroom. They secured the scene and started asking questions. I explained how I had found the body and why I was there. About a week had passed since that fateful day. I spent my days working part-time wherever I could, trying to find a permanent job. The closure of Henderson Manufacturing had left a significant gap in my resume, and the job market was tough. I hoped for some news about the investigation, but nothing had come my way. One evening, as I was finishing up a shift at a local hardware store, my phone rang. It was Kevin, an old friend who worked in the police department. "Hey Dan, I heard you were a witness in a murder investigation. Can we meet? There are some things you need to know." "Sure, Kevin, where do you want to meet?" I asked, intrigued. "How about the cafe on Main Street, say in an hour?" he suggested. "Sounds good. See you there," I agreed, feeling a mix of curiosity and apprehension. An hour later, we were sitting in the cafe, sipping coffee. Kevin leaned in, lowering his voice. "Dan, the case involving Greg's murder has taken some fascinating turns. I thought you'd want to know." I nodded, eager to hear more. "What did you find out?" Kevin began. Greg had been planning the hacker raid on Henderson Manufacturing for some time. However, he didn't have any highly skilled hackers besides himself and an old friend. They agreed to split the proceeds of the raid equally. I leaned forward, listening intently as Kevin continued. The raid was successful, but Greg's friend had no intention of sharing the money. After the hack, Greg went home thinking he was going to celebrate, but his friend had other plans. "So his friend double-crossed him?" I asked, piecing the story together. "Exactly," Kevin confirmed. Greg's friend went to his house with bad intentions. He likely planned to kill Greg to take all the money for himself. Greg might have even initially thought his friend was there to help him get rid of any loose ends, including your wife. But the friend had a different plan. I shook my head in disbelief. "And what about Claire? Did Greg's friend go after her too?" Kevin sighed. "It's likely. The young salesman at the store told Greg everything when you and the police left. Greg must have guessed Claire's involvement and planned to take revenge on her, probably through an explosion using her phone or car. But he didn't get the chance. His friend killed him, took all the money, and disappeared." "So now they're looking for Greg's friend?" I asked, feeling a mix of relief and concern. "Yes," Kevin said, "we're still looking for him." I sat back, processing everything. "Thanks for telling me, Kevin. This whole situation is a nightmare." Kevin nodded sympathetically. "I thought you should know. Stay safe, Dan. And if you hear anything or remember anything that might help, let us know." "I will," I assured him. "Thanks again, Kevin." At this point, we said goodbye and went our separate ways. It's been a few months since everything came crashing down. Today, I'm sitting in my new office, working as a manager for a small local business. The pay isn't great. It's much less than what I was making at Henderson Manufacturing, but it's enough to get by. The work is steady, and for now, that's what I need. I see Josh regularly. He's doing well at college and seems to have adapted to the changes better than I expected. We have dinner together at least once a week, and he often comes to visit on weekends. It's comforting to have that connection with him, especially after everything that's happened. As for Greg's friend, there's still no news. The police haven't caught him, and there haven't been any new leads. It's unsettling to know he's still out there, but I've learned to live with it. Claire and I haven't spoken since she left. She took her share of the property and moved back in with her parents. I don't know what she's doing now, and honestly, I don't care. With smoking, things improved. In this small company, there were much fewer reasons to worry and reasons to reach for a cigarette accordingly.